Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to wake up as a king? In a world where almost nothing about royal life was comfortable. Not the velvet robes, not the towering castles, not even the crown. Picture a cold stone chamber before dawn. The air smells faintly of smoke from last night's fire, mixed with damp wool, beeswax candles, and the slow breath of a draught creeping through the cracks of ancient walls. Somewhere outside, a rooster calls across a muddy courtyard. The castle is stirring, slowly, reluctantly, like a giant creature waking from sleep. This is not the glittering world of fairy tales. It is quieter, stranger, and in ways that might surprise you, deeply ordinary. What did medieval kings and queens actually do all day? What filled the long hours between ceremonies, feasts, and wars? Why did the most powerful people in Europe spend so much of their lives waiting, praying, eating, listening to petitions, and trying to stay warm? And perhaps most curious of all, why does the real daily life of medieval royalty feel less like a heroic epic and more like a slow, repetitive routine inside enormous stone walls? If this story helps you relax tonight, you might consider subscribing to the channel. It's a small gesture, but it quietly keeps these nighttime journeys through history going. And if you happen to still be awake for a moment, tell me where you're listening from. I read those comments like tiny stars on a map, each one marking another sleepy traveller somewhere in the world. For now, take a slow breath in and let it fall away. Feel the quiet around you settle. Make yourself comfortable wherever you are, and let the edges of your day slowly blur. Tonight, we're not chasing dramatic battles or heroic legends. Instead, we're stepping into the slow rhythm of everyday life inside a medieval palace. So now, let's drift backward, not millions of years this time, but nearly 1,000, into a world of stone castles, flickering candlelight, heavy crowns, and surprisingly dull daily routines. A world where even kings sometimes woke up tired, cold, and wondering how long the day might feel. You wake before the sun has fully reached the stone towers of the castle. The room is dim and grey, the light outside still weak and watery as it filters through narrow windows cut into walls several feet thick. Even beneath layers of wool blankets, the cold finds its way in. Medieval castles were magnificent to look at, but remarkably poor at holding warmth. The fire in the hearth burned low during the night, leaving the air sharp and damp. As a royal, this is how almost every morning begins, not with luxury, but with the quiet chill of stone, smoke, and another long day that will unfold slowly within the walls of the castle. The first sensation of the day is usually not comfort, it is temperature. Stone has a memory for cold. During long medieval winters, the walls of a castle absorb the night air and hold it with quiet determination. Even thick tapestries, those enormous woven scenes of hunting and forest that decorate the walls, struggle to keep warmth from slipping away. You pull the heavy blanket slightly closer. Somewhere beyond the chamber door, the castle is beginning to wake. Footsteps echo along narrow corridors. A door closes softly. Wood shifts and creaks in the slow way that ancient buildings do when the morning air begins to move. Outside the window, the sky is pale and uncertain. Medieval mornings rarely explode into bright sunlight. Instead, dawn arrives gently, with mist rising from fields and forests beyond the castle walls. And for a moment you simply lie still. Kings and queens, despite the stories told about them, often began their days slowly. There is no alarm clock, no sudden rush into activity. The rhythm of medieval life is shaped more by daylight and church bells than by strict schedules. Eventually, the first servant enters quietly. He moves carefully, aware that the royal chamber is both a private space and a place filled with silent rules. He stirs the fire in the hearth, feeding small pieces of wood into the bed of glowing embers. The room slowly fills with the familiar smell of smoke and warming oak. The fire is not only for comfort, it is necessary. In many medieval castles, winter temperatures inside the chambers could fall low enough to freeze water left overnight in metal cups. Wealth and status did not entirely protect royalty from the stubborn realities of stone architecture and northern European weather. You sit up slowly. Heavy wool curtains shift slightly in the early breeze slipping through the window slit. The air smells faintly of beeswax candles burned during the night, mixed with the earthy scent of damp stone. Beyond the walls, the kingdom is already awake. Farmers walk toward their fields. Bakers prepare ovens. Markets will soon begin filling with merchants and carts. But inside the castle, time moves differently. Here, the morning unfolds in stages: fire, light, clothing, prayer, meals, meetings. Every day follows a pattern so familiar that the hours begin to blend together across months and years. Think about that for a moment. You rule a kingdom. Your authority stretches across forests, rivers, villages, and towns, yet your morning begins much like anyone else's in the medieval world. You wake, you feel the cold, you wait for the fire to warm the room, and slowly, the machinery of the royal day begins to turn. Before you can even leave your bed, a small procession of attendants enters the chamber. In medieval royal life, even the act of getting dressed becomes a quiet ceremony. Servants bring warmed garments, brushes, basins of water, and carefully folded layers of cloth. Clothing for royalty is complicated, heavy, and symbolic. Every piece carries meaning, rank, wealth, political alliances, even regional loyalties stitched into fabric and thread. So while the world outside the castle is already moving, farmers walking fields, merchants opening stalls, you're still here, standing patiently as multiple people help you into the layers that signal your place at the very top of society. Getting dressed is not something you do alone. It is something that happens around you. First comes the linen underlayer, soft compared to the rougher fabrics worn by most people in the kingdom. Linen helps protect the outer garments from sweat and dirt, which matters in a world where clothing is expensive and washing large garments is difficult. A servant holds the fabric open while another smooths the wrinkles. Then come the heavier layers, wool tunics, sometimes lined with fur during colder months, belts embroidered with thread that may have travelled across continents, cloaks dyed in colours that ordinary citizens are often forbidden to wear. Colour itself is a form of power. Certain shades, deep purples, bright reds, rich blues, require rare dyes imported from distant regions. These pigments cost enormous amounts of money. When you wear them, everyone who sees you understands immediately that you belong to the highest level of society. Even the smallest detail carries significance. Buttons made of bone, silver, or carved wood, embroidered patterns that quietly display the symbols of a royal house, jewellery that signals alliances between families. As each layer is added, your identity becomes more visible. You're no longer simply a person waking in a cold room. You are the ruler. But the process is slow. Clothing in the medieval world is not designed for speed. Ties must be secured, belts fastened, sleeves adjusted. Cloaks drape across shoulders in careful folds. Boots are pulled on and laced tightly. All of this takes time, sometimes a surprising amount of time. While this quiet ceremony unfolds, conversations often begin. Advisors might whisper early updates about the day ahead. A messenger may deliver a letter that arrived during the night. A servant reports the arrival of visiting nobles who hope for an audience later in the day. The room gradually becomes a small centre of activity, yet you remain standing still while others work around you. Think about how strange that might feel, to be the most powerful person in the kingdom, and yet begin each day waiting patiently while someone ties your sleeves and adjusts your cloak. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of medieval royalty. Power brings prestige, ceremony, and enormous influence. But it also removes many of the small, ordinary freedoms most people take for granted. Even something as simple as getting dressed becomes a performance, and by the time the final cloak settles across your shoulders, the castle is fully awake. The day of ruling can finally begin. Eventually food arrives, though breakfast in the medieval world looks very different from the one you might imagine today. There is no coffee to jolt the mind awake, no cereal, toast, or quick morning meal. Instead, you're served bread that may already be a day or two old, perhaps softened with broth or small portions of meat. Ale or watered wine is often safer to drink than plain water. Meals are practical rather than exciting. Even for royalty, food is less about indulgence and more about maintaining strength for the slow responsibilities that fill the hours ahead. The concept of breakfast itself is surprisingly modest. In many medieval households, the main meals come later in the day. Morning food is light, practical, and often simple enough to prepare quickly after the castle kitchens begin to stir. You sit at a long wooden table near the hearth. Steam rises from a bowl of warm pottage, a thick mixture of grains, vegetables, and occasionally small pieces of meat. The exact ingredients change depending on the season and the supplies available in the castle stores. Bread is always present. Bread forms the backbone of medieval diets across every level of society. Even kings and queens eat large amounts of it, though the royal version is usually made from finer wheat flour instead of the darker grains consumed by peasants. The loaf might be slightly hard around the edges, but that is expected. Fresh bread requires time and fuel to bake, and large kitchens often prepare loaves in batches that last several days. You tear a piece slowly. Nearby, servants move quietly across the room carrying plates, pitchers, and small wooden bowls. A cup of ale is placed near your hand. It may seem unusual to modern minds, but fermented drinks are often safer than untreated water in medieval towns and castles. The alcohol is mild, just enough to preserve the liquid and keep harmful microbes at bay. Across the table sit a few trusted advisors and members of the household. Breakfast becomes a gentle beginning to the day's conversations. Plans are discussed. News from nearby regions is shared. Sometimes the talk drifts toward hunting, weather, or small rumours circulating through the court. The atmosphere is calm. There is no rush. Think about the pace of this moment. No phones buzzing. No sudden alarms demanding attention. No hurried commute waiting outside the door. Instead, the morning unfolds slowly, measured by the crackle of the hearth and the quiet exchange of words between people who will spend the entire day within the same stone walls. Even kings need time to wake fully. The human mind, after all, does not transform instantly from sleep to strategy. So you eat, you listen, you take another sip of ale, and beyond the narrow windows the medieval world continues its steady movement. Farmers guiding ploughs through damp soil, merchants arranging goods in market stalls, monks chanting morning prayers in distant monasteries. But here in the castle, the day is only just beginning, and the first responsibilities of power are already waiting. Not long after the morning meal, the real work of ruling begins, and it often looks surprisingly mundane. People arrive, many people, courtiers, messengers, nobles, clergy, advisors, and ordinary subjects with complaints or requests. They line up in halls and chambers, waiting for their turn to speak. One by one, they present disputes over land, taxes, marriages, debts, inheritance, and accusations that range from petty to serious. As ruler, you listen, nod, ask questions, and slowly move through the steady river of human problems that flows through the court every day. This is governance in its most direct form. Not grand speeches, not dramatic battles, just people and their problems. The chamber fills gradually. Boots scrape softly across stone floors as petitioners shuffle forward in quiet anticipation. Some hold rolled parchments sealed with wax. Others simply clutch their caps nervously in their hands. A guard announces each visitor. A dispute between neighbouring farmers. A merchant seeking permission to transport goods through a toll road. A noble arguing that a rival family has crossed a boundary line on disputed land. Each story unfolds slowly. Voices rise, then soften again as advisors ask careful questions. Witnesses sometimes appear. Documents are unrolled and examined. You listen. Sometimes you decide immediately. Other times you pause, consulting counsellors who stand nearby like quiet shadows offering suggestions. In the medieval world, the ruler often acts as the highest judge in the land. When local courts fail to settle a dispute, people travel great distances hoping to place their problem before the crown. Imagine the patience required. Hour after hour, story after story. Some are serious, some are strangely small. Arguments over pigs wandering across property lines, complaints about stolen tools, disagreements between families that have simmered quietly for generations. Yet every case matters, because every decision reinforces the authority of the crown. If justice appears fair, loyalty grows stronger. If it appears careless or biased, resentment spreads through the kingdom like slow-moving fog. So you listen carefully, you weigh the details, and occasionally when the arguments become especially tangled, you simply sigh quietly and ask the next petitioner to step forward. The line never seems to end. But this steady flow of voices forms the true pulse of medieval rule. Not battles, not crowns, just the endless, complicated business of human life. Despite the size of castles and palaces, daily life inside them often moves slowly. There are long stretches where nothing dramatic happens at all. The thick walls mute outside noise, and the rhythm of court becomes predictable. Meals, meetings, prayers, and waiting. In many ways, medieval royalty lives in a strange bubble of controlled stillness, while the far larger world beyond the castle continues its rough and unpredictable life. Once the morning petitions fade, a quiet lull often settles across the castle. Servants clear away documents. Guards return to their posts along stairways and corridors. Advisors drift away to prepare reports or letters. The great hall, so busy only an hour earlier, grows calm again. You remain inside a structure built to resist chaos. The thick stone walls that surround you are designed to survive sieges and battles. They block arrows, deflect fire, and discourage invaders. But they also isolate. Sound travels differently inside a castle. The outside world feels distant, almost muted. Even when storms pass over the surrounding countryside, only the dull rumble of thunder reaches the inner chambers. Life becomes contained. Days unfold according to rituals that rarely change. Morning meetings, midday meals, afternoon discussions, evening prayers. This repetition creates a strange atmosphere of stillness. Think about how unusual that might feel. You command armies. You oversee lands stretching across forests and rivers, yet most days are spent inside the same sequence of rooms. Stone corridors, wooden doors, candlelit halls. The outside world full of mud, weather, markets, animals, and unpredictable human life feels far away. For some rulers, this quiet routine becomes comforting. For others, it slowly turns into a kind of invisible cage. There are moments when you might walk along the castle walls simply to feel the wind. From the towers you can see fields stretching toward distant villages. Smoke rises from chimneys. Tiny figures move slowly across the land below. That is the kingdom you rule, yet you experience most of it through letters, reports, and visiting messengers. It is a curious contradiction. Immense authority paired with surprising physical confinement, and inside this calm, echoing castle. The hours pass slowly, almost quietly, until the next event begins to stir the court once again. Castles may appear grand in paintings and movies, but in reality they're built first and foremost for defence. Thick walls, narrow windows, stone floors, and high ceilings all serve military purposes, but they also trap cold air and moisture. Even the richest rulers spend winters wrapped in layers of wool and fur. Drafts slip through stone joints, smoke lingers in rooms, and dampness slowly seeps into furniture and bedding. The royal lifestyle, despite its prestige, is rarely comfortable by modern standards. If you pause for a moment and look closely at the architecture around you, the reason becomes clear. A castle is not designed as a home, it is designed as a fortress. The walls are several feet thick, built from rough stone hauled from nearby quarries. These massive barriers protect against arrows, siege weapons, and invading armies. They also limit the size of windows. Most openings are narrow slits, barely wide enough to let light inside while still allowing archers to defend the walls. The result is a building that struggles to hold warmth. Sunlight enters slowly, sometimes barely touching the deepest chambers at all. Even during midday, parts of the castle remain dim and shadowed. Fires burn in hearths throughout the halls, but they cannot reach every corner. Heat rises quickly toward the high ceilings. The warm air gathers above while the floors remain cool beneath your boots. During winter, the chill becomes persistent. Servants constantly carry wood to keep fireplaces burning, yet even a large fire rarely warms the entire chamber. Tapestries are hung along the walls to block drafts and add insulation, their thick woven threads capturing small pockets of warmth. These tapestries often depict scenes of hunting, forests, mythical animals, or religious stories. They serve two purposes: decoration and survival. Without them, the stone walls would radiate cold directly into the room. Even the furniture reflects the climate. Beds are built with wooden frames and enclosed by curtains to trap warmth during the night. Heavy blankets made from wool or fur pile high across the mattress. When you climb beneath them, the layers form a small pocket of heat against the cold air of the chamber. But comfort remains limited. Moisture seeps slowly through stone during wet seasons, giving the castle a faint, earthy smell. Smoke from fireplaces sometimes lingers in the air, especially when wind pushes down the chimneys. Think about breathing that atmosphere every day. The scent of burning wood, damp stone, animal furs, cooked meat drifting in from distant kitchens. For medieval people, these smells form the normal background of life. Visitors from modern times might find it overwhelming. And yet, despite these conditions, castles represent the height of security and prestige. To live inside one means protection, authority, and visibility within the political world of the kingdom. This is the strange trade of medieval royalty. You gain immense power, but you live inside a structure built more for war than comfort. And so each day, as the wind presses quietly against the stone towers, the castle stands firm, solid, imposing, and just a little bit cold. One of the more quietly unpleasant realities of medieval life involves something rarely discussed in fairy tales: sanitation. Castles rely on simple solutions called garderobes. small chambers where waste drops down shafts into pits or moats below. The smell, unfortunately, does not always stay outside. Even royalty must live within a world where plumbing is non-existent and hygiene practices are still developing. It is one of many reminders that power does not always guarantee comfort. You walk down a narrow passageway built into the castle wall. The corridor is dim, lit only by a small window opening that lets in a thin line of daylight. At the end of the passage sits a small stone alcove with a wooden seat. This is the garderobe, the medieval version of a bathroom. Beneath the seat, a vertical shaft drops through the thickness of the castle wall. Waste falls downward into a pit below, sometimes landing in a moat, sometimes in a deep trench where servants periodically remove it. It is not an elegant system, but it works most of the time. During windy days, air flowing through the shaft helps carry odours away from the chamber. But when the wind shifts, unpleasant smells sometimes drift back up the passage. Medieval castles contain multiple garderobes scattered throughout the structure, often positioned along outer walls so the shafts can run directly downward. Even royal apartments include them. Though they are occasionally decorated with wooden panels or curtains, the basic design remains the same: practical, simple, and slightly uncomfortable. Think about how different daily hygiene must feel in this environment. There are no porcelain toilets, no running water, no soap dispensers or tiled floors. Instead, cleanliness relies on buckets of water carried by servants, small cloths for washing, and occasional visits to heated bathhouses when they are available. Bathing itself is less frequent than many people today might expect, partly because heating large quantities of water requires enormous amounts of firewood, partly because medical theories of the time sometimes warn that hot baths open the pores too widely, allowing illness to enter the body. So personal hygiene becomes a balance between practicality and cultural belief. Clothes absorb sweat. Perfumes made from herbs and flowers help mask strong smells. Fresh linen garments are changed when possible, and yet, even within royal households, the air of a medieval castle carries a mixture of scents: wood smoke, cooking meat, animal skins, human life. It is easy to imagine royal life as pristine and polished, but the truth is far more grounded in the realities of the era. Kings and queens live with the same limitations as everyone else, only surrounded by thicker walls and heavier curtains, and so, quietly tucked into the stone architecture of every castle. The garderobe remains one of the most honest reminders that medieval life was far less glamorous than the stories suggest. Every movement inside a royal court carries layers of social meaning. Where someone stands, how deeply they bow, who speaks first, who sits closest to the throne, all of it forms a complex choreography of status and influence. You learn to read these subtle signals carefully. In this environment, a misplaced glance or an ignored greeting can quietly alter alliances that shape entire kingdoms. When you enter the Great Hall, everyone is already watching. Not openly, of course, but carefully. Courts operate like delicate ecosystems, where every gesture communicates something important. Nobles observe one another with quiet attention, measuring respect, influence, and favour. You move toward the raised platform where the throne sits. As you walk, courtiers step aside just enough to acknowledge your presence. Some bow deeply, others incline their heads more subtly, depending on their rank. These movements may seem small, yet they form the invisible language of medieval politics. Consider the order in which people are allowed to approach the throne. High-ranking nobles stand closer, lesser officials wait farther back, messengers and minor petitioners remain near the edges of the chamber until they are called forward. Even silence carries meaning. If two nobles refuse to acknowledge each other with a greeting, It signals tension between their families. If one suddenly begins standing nearer the throne than before, it may suggest that the ruler has recently granted new favour. These signals ripple outward across the court. People notice. They talk quietly later in private rooms and corridors. Imagine trying to navigate this world every day. Every conversation must be measured, every glance carefully controlled. Even laughter can carry unintended consequences if it appears at the wrong moment. This constant awareness shapes the personality of royal courts. Politeness becomes highly refined. Words are chosen carefully. Insults, when they occur, are often disguised beneath layers of formal language. Yet beneath the calm surface, ambition flows quietly. Nobles compete for influence, seeking royal favour that might bring land, titles, or political advantage. A well-timed compliment might open doors. A careless remark might close them permanently. So you learn to read the room. You notice who stands together in whispered conversations. You notice who avoids eye contact. You notice when someone bows slightly deeper than usual. All of it matters. And as the hours pass inside the great hall, this slow theatre of etiquette unfolds again and again, subtle, careful, and endlessly fascinating to those who live within its rules. Religion fills a significant portion of medieval royal life. Bells echo through castle courtyards at regular intervals, calling everyone to prayer. Kings and queens attend multiple services throughout the day, guided by the belief that divine favour directly affects the stability of their rule. The chapel becomes a place of reflection, but also political symbolism, reinforcing the idea that authority flows from heaven as much as from earthly power. At certain moments during the day, the sound of bells drifts across the castle. Their tone is deep and steady, rolling through courtyards and stone corridors like gentle waves of metal and air. These bells mark the hours of prayer. For medieval rulers, religion is not a private hobby or occasional ceremony. It is woven directly into the structure of daily life. You rise from your chamber and walk toward the chapel, accompanied by a small group of attendants. The chapel itself is one of the most carefully decorated spaces in the castle. Coloured glass windows scatter soft light across stone floors. Painted icons and carved statues line the walls. Candles flicker before altars, filling the air with the warm scent of melted wax. As you kneel, the quiet rhythm of prayer begins. Monks or priests chant softly, their voices echoing upward into the vaulted ceiling. Latin phrases rise and fall in slow patterns that have been repeated for centuries. Think about the atmosphere of this moment. Outside the castle, the world is noisy and unpredictable. Farmers argue over land. Merchants negotiate prices. Storms roll across the countryside. But inside the chapel, time feels different. Still, measured, sacred. For rulers, prayer also carries political meaning. Medieval societies believed strongly that kings rule by divine approval. If crops fail or wars go badly, people may interpret those events as signs that the ruler has lost favour with heaven, so public devotion matters. Attending prayer services reassures both the court and the wider population that the crown remains aligned with divine will. You bow your head again. The chanting continues, and for a moment, the responsibilities of ruling, the endless petitions, disputes, and decisions fade into the quiet background of candlelight and prayer. Later in the day, the castle gathers for the main meal, an event that can last hours. Tables fill with roasted meats, stews, bread, cheese, and seasonal vegetables. Music might play softly in the background while entertainers perform small acts to pass the time. Yet even feasts are structured by rigid hierarchy. Who sits where, who receives the best cuts of meat, and who serves whom all reinforce the invisible structure that holds the royal court together. The great hall transforms as the meal begins. Long wooden tables stretch across the chamber, their surfaces covered with cloth and simple wooden plates. Servants move quickly between the kitchens and the hall, carrying platters that release clouds of savoury steam. The smell alone fills the room. Roasted venison, boiled root vegetables, fresh loaves of bread, spice sauces imported from distant markets. These meals are not quick gatherings. They unfold slowly, often lasting several hours. First come the opening dishes, bread, cheese, and lighter foods that allow guests to settle into conversation. Musicians sometimes sit near the far wall, playing soft melodies on lutes or fiddles while the hall gradually fills. Then the larger courses arrive. Whole birds roasted over open fires, stews thick with barley and herbs, fish prepared according to religious fasting rules on certain days. Each platter travels down the table, where guests cut portions using personal knives. Forks are still rare in much of medieval Europe. Most people eat using knives, spoons, and pieces of bread that act as edible plates. Conversation flows steadily. Nobles discuss politics, trade routes, hunting plans, and family alliances. Laughter occasionally rises from the lower tables where younger members of the court sit together. Yet the hierarchy remains visible. You sit at the high table. The most honoured guests sit nearest. Lower ranks stretch farther down the hall. Even the food reflects this structure. The finest cuts of meat appear first at the high table, before moving outward to the rest of the room. It is a quiet demonstration of status repeated every day. Think about how powerful such rituals become when practiced constantly. Over months and years they reinforce the social order until it feels almost natural. And so the meal continues, slowly, steadily. While candlelight flickers across stone walls and the castle hums with the familiar rhythm of medieval life. In medieval courts, where you sit at dinner can matter almost as much as what is being served. Seating charts reflect delicate balances of power. A noble placed slightly closer to the ruler may gain prestige, while another seated farther away might interpret the distance as a subtle political message. Entire alliances can shift based on these quiet signals delivered across long wooden tables. When you enter the great hall for the evening meal, the arrangement has already been carefully decided. Servants know exactly where each chair belongs. Advisors have quietly debated the placements long before the guests arrive. What appears to be a simple dinner gathering is, in truth, a carefully constructed map of influence. You move toward the high table at the far end of the hall. This table sits slightly elevated, often on a low platform known as the dais. From here you can see the entire room, the rows of tables stretching outward, the flickering torchlight reflecting on metal goblets, the slow movement of servants weaving between guests. But what matters most tonight is who sits near you. To your right may sit a powerful noble whose lands guard an important border. To your left, perhaps a visiting envoy from another kingdom, someone whose presence signals fragile diplomacy and progress. Every seat is a message. Courtiers notice immediately when someone new appears close to the throne. A merchant recently granted trading privileges might be invited nearer than usual. A young noble whose loyalty must be encouraged might suddenly find himself seated just within the inner circle. Small changes create quiet waves of speculation. Across the hall, conversations pause for a moment as people observe the arrangement. No one comments openly, but everyone understands that distance from the high table reflects closeness to power. Imagine living inside a world where something as ordinary as dinner seating carries such weight. A chair moved a few feet closer might elevate a family's reputation for years. A chair moved farther away might signal fading favour. Sometimes the changes are intentional, other times they're subtle corrections, ways to calm rivalries before they grow dangerous. If two powerful families have been arguing, placing their representatives near each other allows the ruler to observe their behavior, or perhaps to encourage reconciliation. You watch the hall slowly fill. Guests approach their assigned places with polite expressions, though some glance quietly toward the high table, measuring their position in the invisible hierarchy. A noble seated slightly farther away than expected might feel a quiet sting of embarrassment. Another seated unusually close might struggle to hide a satisfied smile. Think about how delicate these signals become over time. No official announcement is needed, no proclamation carved in stone, just a chair, just a table, and an entire court carefully reading the meaning hidden in the space between them. In medieval politics, even dinner becomes a language of power, and you, sitting at the centre of it all, speak that language without saying a single word. When the day's formal duties pause, entertainment arrives in simpler forms. Travelling musicians, storytellers, jugglers and poets fill castle halls with songs and tales of distant lands. For royalty, these performances are small windows into a wider world. Without books widely available or modern media, stories carried by wandering performers become an important source of imagination and news. After the long meal begins to settle, the hall slowly shifts into a softer mood. Servants clear away the largest platters. Candles are adjusted along the walls. Conversation fades slightly as attention turns toward the open space near the centre of the room. This is where the entertainers perform. A travelling musician steps forward first, carrying a lute whose polished wood glows faintly in the firelight. He bows deeply before beginning a slow melody, his fingers moving carefully across the strings. The sound spreads gently across the hall. In a world without recorded music, every note exists only in the moment it is played. When the song ends, it disappears completely, leaving behind only the memory carried by those who heard it. That fleeting quality makes performances feel strangely precious. Soon another figure steps forward, a storyteller wrapped in a worn cloak from many miles of travel. He begins speaking in a calm, steady voice, recounting tales of distant cities, strange markets, and heroic adventures. Some stories are legends. Others contain fragments of real events carried along trade routes. News travels slowly in the medieval world. Wandering performers often bring the first whispers of changes happening far beyond the kingdom's borders. A war beginning in another region, a great storm that damaged coastal ports, a newly crowned ruler somewhere across the mountains. As the story unfolds, the court listens quietly. For many people inside the castle, these tales offer rare glimpses of places they may never see themselves. Travel is dangerous and slow, so imagination becomes the primary way of exploring the wider world. Next comes a juggler. He tosses small wooden balls into the air, catching them again with smooth rhythm. The act is simple by modern standards, yet it draws soft laughter and applause from the gathered nobles. Entertainment does not need elaborate technology. Human skill and storytelling are enough. Think about the atmosphere in this moment. Firelight flickering along stone walls, the quiet hum of voices between performances, the distant wind brushing against the towers outside. The castle feels almost cozy despite its massive scale. For a little while the burdens of ruling fade into the background. Kings and queens become simply members of the audience, sharing the same curiosity and amusement as everyone else in the hall. And in that shared moment of listening and laughter, the rigid structure of the court softens just slightly, not disappearing completely, but relaxing enough for the evening to breathe. Royal meals may seem abundant, but nutrition is uneven. Diets are heavy in meat, bread, and alcohol, with fewer fresh vegetables during much of the year. Spices imported from distant regions signal wealth and global trade connections. Yet despite these luxuries, long-term health problems often appear among medieval elites, quietly shaped by diet, stress, and limited medical knowledge. When you examine the food placed before medieval royalty, something curious appears. The meals look rich, but they are not always balanced. Large portions of meat dominate the table, venison from forest hunts, pork raised on nearby estates, poultry roasted slowly over open flames. These foods symbolize wealth because meat requires land, animals, and resources to produce. But eating large amounts of it every day carries consequences. Bread accompanies nearly every dish. Thick loaves made from refined wheat flour appear frequently in royal households, a sign of status compared to the darker grains eaten by peasants. Bread fills the stomach and provides steady energy, yet vegetables and fruits are less predictable. During summer and early autumn, fresh produce from gardens may appear regularly: cabbage, onions, carrots, apples, and herbs. But during winter months, the selection shrinks dramatically. Preserved foods take their place: pickled vegetables, dried fruits, salted meats stored in cool cellars. The medieval diet follows the rhythm of the seasons more closely than modern diets ever do. Spices add another layer to the royal table. Cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg arrive through long trade networks stretching across continents. These spices cost enormous sums of money, sometimes worth more than precious metals by weight. Adding them to food becomes a subtle display of wealth. Guests immediately recognize their presence. A dish flavoured with imported spice announces the reach of the royal trade connections without needing a single word. Yet despite these luxuries, health challenges remain common. Excessive meat consumption combined with limited medical knowledge sometimes leads to digestive illnesses, joint pain, and other long-term conditions. Medieval physicians attempt to explain these problems through the theory of bodily humours, a system suggesting that health depends on balancing different fluids inside the body. If someone eats too much rich food, physicians may prescribe lighter meals, herbal tonics, or even bloodletting to restore balance. Today we understand nutrition differently, but at the time these treatments represent the best knowledge available. So while the royal table appears abundant and impressive, it quietly carries its own risks. Food in the medieval world is never simply about pleasure. It is shaped by trade, climate, culture, and medical belief. And even kings and queens must live within the limits of that system. When illness arrives, physicians rely on a mixture of ancient theory, observation, and hopeful experimentation. Medieval medicine is guided by the idea of bodily humours, balances between fluids that supposedly govern health. Treatments may include herbal mixtures, bloodletting, careful diets, and prayers. Even kings and queens must place their trust in a system that blends science, tradition, and faith. Imagine waking one morning with a fever. Your head feels heavy. Your body aches. The cold stone walls of the castle suddenly feel even less welcoming. Word travels quickly through the royal household. Soon a physician arrives. Medieval doctors often receive education through universities or apprenticeships, studying texts written centuries earlier by Greek and Roman scholars. These writings describe the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, according to this belief, depends on maintaining the proper balance between these fluids. If the body becomes too hot, too cold, too dry, or too moist, illness appears. The physician begins by observing carefully. He studies the colour of your skin, listens to your breathing, and asks questions about your symptoms. A small glass vial may be used to examine urine, which physicians believe reveals clues about internal balance. After a few quiet moments of consideration, the diagnosis is made. Perhaps the body contains too much heat, or too much blood. To correct the imbalance, treatments begin. Herbal mixtures brewed from plants gathered in nearby forests may be prepared. Honey, vinegar, and spices might be added to improve the taste. Sometimes physicians recommend dietary changes, lighter foods, certain fruits, or broth instead of heavy meat. In more serious cases, bloodletting may occur. Using a small blade or specialized tool, the physician removes a controlled amount of blood from the body. The belief is that reducing excess blood helps restore equilibrium among the humours. Today this practice sounds alarming, but within the scientific framework of the time, it appears logical and responsible. Medicine in the medieval world operates at the intersection of knowledge, observation, and faith. Prayer often accompanies treatment. Priests may visit the chamber to offer blessings, asking for divine help in restoring health. Relics of saints are sometimes placed nearby, believed to carry protective power. For rulers, illness carries additional weight. A sick king or queen raises quiet concerns across the kingdom. Advisors begin discussing succession plans. Nobles watch carefully for signs of weakness that might alter political balance. So recovery becomes more than a personal matter. It becomes a question of stability. And as the physician mixes herbs beside the hearth, everyone waits quietly, hoping that ancient theories and careful observation will be enough to restore the ruler's strength. Food and drink carry a quiet risk for anyone in power. Poisoning, though rare, remains a real possibility in a world where political rivalries run deep. Trusted servants taste dishes before they reach the royal table. Goblets and plates are watched carefully. The act of eating becomes both nourishment and a subtle reminder of how fragile authority can be. As you sit at the table, the meal arrives in stages. Servants carry platters carefully from the kitchens, placing them before the high table with practiced movements. Steam rises from roasted meats and bowls of stew. But before you take the first bite, another quiet ritual takes place. A servant tastes the food. This individual, sometimes known as a food taster, samples each dish moments before it reaches you. The task is simple in theory. If the food contains poison, the taster will experience its effects first. In reality, the situation is more complicated. Poisoning is not extremely common in medieval courts, but it remains a persistent fear. Political rivalries, inheritance disputes, and power struggles occasionally create situations where removing a ruler might benefit someone ambitious enough to attempt it. So precautions become routine. Wine is poured from sealed containers opened in front of trusted witnesses. Goblets remain within sight at all times. Plates are handled only by servants whose loyalty has been proven over many years. Even so, the possibility lingers quietly in the background. Imagine living with that awareness every day. A simple meal becomes an exercise in caution. You watch the servant take the first bite. You wait a moment. The court continues talking as if nothing unusual has happened. Music may even be playing in the background. But beneath the calm surface, everyone understands the purpose of the ritual. Once the taster shows no signs of illness, the meal proceeds normally. Conversation resumes. Knives slice through roasted meat. Bread passes from hand to hand. Yet the subtle tension remains part of the environment of power. Because in medieval politics, authority brings both admiration and envy. Many people depend on the stability of the crown, but others quietly dream of replacing it. And so even during the most ordinary moments of royal life, sitting at a table, sharing a meal, the shadow of danger sometimes sits quietly beside you. Not loud, not constant, but never entirely absent. Messengers arrive regularly with news from distant towns, villages, and borders. These letters carry reports of harvests, disputes, military movements, or changing loyalties among nobles. In an age without instant communication, every message represents days or weeks of travel. The ruler must piece together the state of the kingdom through these scattered fragments of information. Late in the afternoon, when the castle has settled into a quieter rhythm, the sound of hooves often echoes through the outer courtyard. A rider has arrived. Dust clings to the horse's legs. The messenger's cloak shows the signs of a long road, dried mud, wind, and the faint smell of rain. Travel across medieval kingdoms is slow and uncertain. Roads twist through forests and farmland, sometimes disappearing entirely during bad weather. So when a messenger appears at the castle gates, the news he carries has likely been travelling for many days, sometimes weeks. You sit in a smaller chamber now, away from the great hall. Advisors gather around a wooden table as the messenger bows and produces a leather satchel filled with sealed parchments. Each letter bears a wax seal. The imprint tells you who sent it, a noble family crest, a bishop's signet ring, or the mark of a regional governor. A servant brings a small knife. The wax cracks softly as you break the seal. Inside, the parchment reveals the slow pulse of the kingdom. One letter reports a poor harvest in a northern valley. Late frost damaged the grain fields, and farmers fear that winter will bring shortages. Another describes a dispute between two noble families over grazing rights near a river border. A third message brings quiet political tension. A local lord has begun gathering more soldiers than usual. The letter's writer is not certain why, but the tone suggests unease. Think about the strange challenge of ruling a medieval kingdom. You rarely see most of it yourself. Instead, you understand your realm through fragments like these, handwritten reports carried by tired riders across forests and hills. The map of the kingdom forms slowly in your mind, not as a physical landscape, but as a web of stories, concerns, rumours and requests. Some messages bring good news. A bridge repaired after spring floods, a monastery expanding its farmland, a town market growing more prosperous. Others carry quiet warnings, bandits along a trade road, unrest among peasants after new taxes, a neighbouring ruler making alliances that might someday shift the balance of power. You listen as advisors read certain letters aloud. They discuss possible responses, sending additional grain to struggling villages, writing formal judgments to settle disputes, dispatching inspectors to investigate suspicious activity. Every decision will travel back outward across the kingdom by the same slow method. Written words, sealed with wax, carried by riders along winding roads. The entire machinery of government depends on this fragile system of communication. Ink, parchment, horses, and patience. And as the final letter is folded and set aside, the messenger receives food, water, and a place to rest. Tomorrow he will ride again. Because somewhere beyond the castle walls the kingdom continues moving, growing, struggling, changing, one message at a time. Running a kingdom involves far more paperwork than most people imagine. Clerks carefully copy decrees, tax records, land grants, and legal rulings by hand onto parchment. Documents pile up in chests and cabinets. Governance moves slowly, measured not in minutes, but in weeks and months, as orders travel outward through the layers of medieval society. In a quiet room near the centre of the castle, the work of government continues long after the great hall has emptied. This is the chamber of the clerks. Here, the air smells faintly of ink, parchment, and candle smoke. Wooden desks stand in rows beneath narrow windows where daylight falls across stacks of documents. Several scribes sit silently, their quills scratching steadily across the page. Scratch. Pause. Scratch again. Each movement of the quill leaves a thin black line on parchment made from carefully prepared animal skin. The process is slow and deliberate. Ink must be applied carefully to avoid blotting the page. Mistakes cannot be erased easily. If a document contains an error, the scribe may need to begin again from the beginning. You sit nearby while a clerk reads a newly prepared decree aloud. It concerns a land dispute settled earlier in the day. The decision must be recorded clearly so that local officials understand exactly how the judgment should be enforced. Every word matters. Ambiguous language could create confusion or even future conflict. Once the wording's approved, the scribe finishes the document and passes it to another official, who presses the royal seal into warm wax at the bottom of the parchment. The seal transforms the document. Without it, the text is simply writing. With it, the order carries the authority of the crown. Think about how slowly information moves in this world. Today, messages can cross continents in seconds. But here, every command must travel physically. A sealed document might take weeks to reach a distant town. Once there, local officials read the decree and begin implementing the instructions. If questions arise, another letter must be written. Another rider must travel. Another reply must return. Governance becomes a slow conversation between the centre of power and the edges of the kingdom. Yet despite the pace, this system works remarkably well for its time. Records accumulate year after year: tax rolls, property grants, marriage alliances, military orders. Over decades, these documents form the written memory of the kingdom. The clerks preserve it carefully. Some records are stored in wooden chests. Others rest inside stone vaults to protect them from fire and moisture. Future rulers will read these pages to understand what decisions were made long before their own reign. And as the scribes continue their steady scratching late into the evening, the quiet machinery of medieval government keeps turning. Slowly, patiently, one line of ink at a time. One of the few activities that truly breaks the monotony of royal life is the hunt. Kings and nobles ride out into forests with horses, dogs, and trained falcons. Hunting serves practical purposes, gathering meat and practicing military skills, but it also offers rare freedom from the rigid structures of court life. Out here, the air moves freely, and the rhythm of the world feels less confined by stone walls. At dawn on certain mornings, the castle gates open wide. Horses stamp their hooves against the cold ground while servants adjust saddles and tighten leather straps. Hunting dogs circle excitedly, sensing that the day will be different from the usual routines of court. You mount your horse and ride beyond the walls. Immediately the world feels wider. The forest stretches outward in deep shades of green and brown. Morning mist drifts slowly through the trees. The air smells fresh, wet soil, pine needles, distant water. After days spent within stone corridors, the open landscape feels almost luxurious. The hunt begins quietly. Trackers examine the ground for signs of deer or boar. Dogs move ahead, sniffing the forest floor. Riders spread out along narrow trails, listening for movement in the underbrush. This activity carries both sport and symbolism. Hunting demonstrates strength, courage, and skill, qualities expected of medieval rulers who must also lead armies during wartime. But it also provides something far simpler: freedom. In the forest, the complex rules of court etiquette fade slightly. Nobles ride side by side without worrying about seating arrangements or ceremonial gestures. Conversation becomes relaxed. Laughter appears more easily. The pace of the day follows the rhythms of the land rather than the schedules of palace life. Suddenly a dog begins barking. The riders gather quickly as the sound of hooves shifts across fallen leaves. A deer bursts from the trees ahead, bounding through the brush with remarkable speed. The chase begins. Horses surge forward, riders leaning low over the saddles as branches whip past. For a few minutes, nothing else exists. No letters, no court politics, no petitions waiting in the great hall, just the rush of movement through the forest and the sharp scent of autumn air. Eventually the hunt ends. Sometimes the animal escapes, sometimes it does not. Either way, the riders slow their horses and regroup beneath tall trees, while the forest gradually returns to silence. You take a long breath. Beyond the branches, the distant towers of the castle rise against the sky. Soon you will return. But for a little while longer, you remain here, outside the stone walls, outside the quiet pressures of court life, simply riding through the open landscape of your kingdom. As the candles burn lower in the halls of the castle, the day finally begins to loosen its grip on the court. The great hall grows quieter now. Servants clear the last wooden plates from the long tables. The musicians have packed away their instruments. The stone corridors that echoed with voices throughout the day slowly return to their natural silence. Outside, night has settled across the kingdom. Beyond the castle walls, villages drift into sleep. Fires fade in farmhouse hearths. The fields, so busy with labour only hours earlier, now rest beneath a sky filled with cold and distant stars. And inside the castle, even kings and queens eventually grow tired. They have listened to disputes over land and livestock. They have read letters carried across forests and rivers. They have weighed alliances, marriages, and rumours that ripple quietly through the court. Power, as it turns out, is not always dramatic. Often it is patient. Often it is repetitive. And sometimes it is quietly boring. When we step back across the centuries, the strange truth of medieval royalty becomes clearer. The crowns were heavy, yes, the castles were enormous, but the daily rhythm of royal life was built from the same small pieces that shape every human life. Waking, eating, listening, deciding, waiting, and eventually resting again. The difference was simply scale. A farmer might worry about the harvest in one small field. A king might worry about the harvest across an entire kingdom. Yet both wake to the same pale dawn. Both feel the same winter cold. Both eventually close their eyes beneath the same quiet sky. And perhaps that is one of the most comforting things history can reveal. Across all the centuries, across all the crowns and thrones and banners, human life has always moved in familiar rhythms. Morning arrives, the day unfolds, evening settles in, and somewhere, beyond the thick stone walls of castles long since crumbled into ruins, the world continues turning. So as you settle deeper into your own quiet moment in time, let the distant echoes of medieval halls slowly fade. Let the candlelight dim. Let the voices of courtiers and messengers drift away into the long silence of history. You are part of a story far longer than any single kingdom. A story stretching across thousands of years, through forests, fields, cities, and forgotten castles. And for now, there is nothing left to decide, nothing left to rule, only the quiet comfort of rest. As the night continues its slow, peaceful watch,